Racist referee cheats black teen, then learns he's a future Olympian. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. Jamal Carter stood at the starting blocks, his muscles coiled with tension. The stadium buzzed with anticipation, the roar of the crowd echoing in his ears. This was it, the state finals. The race he had trained for, sacrificed for. His heart pounded like a drum, his body humming with raw energy. He lowered into position, eyes locked ahead. Just run. Just win. The gun fired. Jamal exploded off the blocks, his feet pounding against the track. The world around him blurred as he surged forward, every muscle working in perfect sync. The finish line loomed ahead, closer, closer. He crossed first. For a split second, time stood still. The crowd erupted. His coach threw his fists in the air. Jamal gasped for breath, overwhelmed by the moment. And then the red flag. The cheers turned into murmurs. Confused faces, whispers of disbelief. Lane violation, the announcer said over the loudspeaker. Jamal Carter is disqualified. Jamal's stomach dropped. What? The other runners glanced around, uncertain. His coach rushed forward, already shouting, "No way, no way, that's a clean run." Jamal turned toward the official, Coach Stevens, the same referee who had made shady calls all season, the one who always seemed to penalize black athletes more harshly than others. Jamal's fists clenched. "That's not true. You know that's not true." Coach Stevens barely glanced at him. Rules are rules. The second-place runner, a white boy from a private school, was announced as the winner. He looked just as stunned as everyone else. Jamal's mother made her way through the crowd, her face a mask of controlled fury. She placed a firm hand on his back. "We'll fight this," she whispered. "This isn't over." But as he stood there, the medal he had rightfully won now hanging around someone else's neck, a bitter truth settled in his chest. This wasn't about rules. This was about keeping him from winning. And Jamal Carter had had enough. That night, Jamal lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed beside him. Messages from teammates, friends, even strangers who had seen what happened. "Bro, you got robbed. That ref is a joke. We all saw it. Stay strong." He scrolled through social media and there it was, the video, a slow-motion replay of his race, proving he had never stepped out of his lane. The comments were flooding in. "This is blatant racism. Disqualifying him was criminal. Why isn't anyone doing anything?" The outrage spread like wildfire. People were tagging news stations, demanding an investigation. Former athletes chimed in, calling it one of the worst officiating decisions they'd ever seen. Jamal's chest ached with frustration. It shouldn't have to be like this. A knock at his door. His mother walked in, holding her phone. "Jamal, you need to see this." She handed it to him, the screen glowing with an incoming call. Unknown number. Jamal hesitated, then answered. A deep voice came through the line. "Jamal Carter?" "Yeah, who's this?" A pause. Then, "My name is Coach Harrison. I used to train Olympic sprinters, and I just watched what they did to you." Jamal sat up straight, his heart pounding. "I think it's time," the man continued, "for you to run somewhere no referee can touch you." Jamal swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" "I mean the Olympics." Silence. Then Jamal exhaled slowly, and he knew his real race was just beginning. The next morning, Jamal stood on the porch, watching the sunrise, his mind replaying the conversation with Coach Harrison. The Olympics. The idea had always been a distant dream, something unattainable for a kid from a small town with limited resources. But now, felt within reach. His mother joined him, a cup of coffee in hand. "You've got that look, Jamal." He glanced at her. "What look?" "The one that means you're about to prove everyone wrong." He smiled, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "I'm going to take his offer. Train for the Olympics." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I knew you would. Training with Coach Harrison." Jamal packed his bags, leaving behind the track that had been both his sanctuary and his battleground. The training facility was a world away, a place where champions were made. Coach Harrison was waiting for him, a tall, grizzled man with the posture of a soldier. His eyes were sharp, assessing Jamal from the moment he arrived. "You've got raw talent," he said, "but we're going to refine it, push you to your limits." Jamal nodded, ready for whatever came next. Days blurred into weeks as he trained harder than ever before. Early mornings, grueling drills, endless sprints. Every session leaving him exhausted but stronger. Coach Harrison was relentless. "Your speed isn't just about your legs, Jamal. It's about your heart, your mind. Every time you run, you're racing against everything that's tried to hold you back." The workouts were brutal, but Jamal thrived on the pain. Each drop of sweat was a defiance against Coach Stevens and every other person who had tried to diminish him. The national qualifiers loom. Months passed, and the national qualifiers were on the horizon. This was Jamal's chance to prove himself, to earn a spot in the Olympic trials. But as the event approached, rumors began circulating. Coach Stevens would be officiating again. Jamal's jaw tightened when he heard the news. The man who had stolen his victory was back, poised to undermine him once more. Coach Harrison noticed the tension in Jamal's stride. "Don't let him get into your head," he warned. "Your victory will be on the track, not in his hands." Jamal nodded, but the anxiety simmered beneath his determination. He couldn't let Stevens ruin this for him. Not again. The day of the national qualifiers. The stadium was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Athletes from all over the country had gathered, each fighting for a shot at the Olympics. Jamal stood at the starting line, the sun beating down on the track. His competitors glanced at him, some with respect, others with indifference. And there, by the officials' tent, stood Coach Stevens, clipboard in hand, eyes cold and calculating. Jamal's heart pounded, but he steadied his breathing. This was his moment. The announcer's voice echoed through the stadium. "Athletes, take your marks." Jamal crouched down, fingers digging into the track, eyes locked on the finish line. The gun fired. He surged forward, legs pumping with explosive power. The track blurred beneath him as he pushed harder, faster, determined to leave everything behind. But halfway through, the air horn blared, a signal to stop the race. Confusion spread across the field. Jamal skidded to a halt, bewildered. Coach Stevens raised his voice, the words sharp and deliberate. "False start. Lane 3, Jamal Carter is disqualified." The crowd murmured in disbelief. Jamal's face flushed with anger. He hadn't moved before the gun. He knew it, and so did everyone else. Coach Harrison stormed over, fury etched in every line of his face. "Show us the footage," he demanded. The officials hesitated, but the crowd began chanting, "Footage! Footage!" Reluctantly, they played the replay on the big screen. The footage was clear. Jamal had started perfectly. Boos erupted from the stands, directed squarely at Coach Stevens. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, photographers snapping furiously. The head official stepped forward, his voice shaky. "The disqualification is overturned. Jamal Carter is reinstated." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in support of the young athlete. Jamal stepped back onto the starting line, eyes blazing. He glanced at Coach Stevens, who looked visibly rattled, the weight of public scrutiny pressing down on him. "Take your marks." The gun fired again. This time, Jamal ran with everything he had. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he pushed forward, each step driving him closer to the finish line. He crossed with a burst of speed, chest heaving as the crowd erupted into deafening applause. The time flashed on the board, a new national record. Jamal sank to his knees, the weight of victory overwhelming him. Coach Harrison was there in an instant, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You did it, kid," he murmured. "You showed them all." Jamal glanced over his shoulder at Coach Stevens, whose face was pale, eyes wide with shock. For the first time, Jamal didn't feel anger or bitterness. He felt vindicated. He had won, fair and square, and no one could take that from him. The cameras flashed as Jamal stood on the podium, gold medal draped around his neck. The national anthem blared through the stadium, but his mind was still racing. He had done it. Despite everything, the unfair calls, the sabotage, the years of being told he wouldn't make it, he had proven them all wrong. Coach Harrison clapped him on the back. "Kid, you just punched your ticket to the Olympic trials." Jamal exhaled sharply. "It's really happening." His mother, waiting near the edge of the track, wiped tears of pride from her eyes. "It's been happening," she said softly. "You just had to believe it." Coach Stevens faces consequences. As Jamal celebrated, news outlets exploded with headlines. Racist referee exposed after attempting to disqualify black athlete. National record holder Jamal Carter overcomes corruption to earn Olympic trials spot. Coach Stevens under investigation for years of biased officiating. The backlash was swift and brutal. The Sports Commission launched a formal investigation into Coach Stevens' career. They uncovered years of suspicious rulings, patterns of disqualifications disproportionately targeting black athletes. A week later, the governing board issued a public statement. Effective immediately, Coach Stevens is permanently banned from officiating any future track and field events. Jamal read the headline, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. Justice, not just for him but for every athlete who had been robbed before him. The Olympic trials, a new stage. The stadium for the Olympic trials was larger than anything Jamal had ever seen. The crowd was massive, the energy electric. He stood in the warm-up area, surrounded by the fastest runners in the country. Men who had been training for this moment their whole lives. He spotted a familiar face, Jordan Reed, a two-time Olympian and reigning national champion. Jordan walked over, offering a nod. "I saw what you went through back at Nationals. That was messed up." Jamal smirked. "Yeah, well, I'm still here." Jordan chuckled. "That you are. Let's see what you've got, kid." Jamal clenched his fists. He wasn't here to just compete. He was here to win. The race that changed everything. The announcer's voice boomed across the stadium. "Runners, take your marks." Jamal crouched down, his heart pounding. The world felt silent. The gun fired. He launched forward with explosive speed, his feet striking the track with powerful precision. The crowd's roar faded as he focused on one thing, the finish line. Jordan was beside him, stride for stride. Jamal pushed harder, faster than he ever had before. With one final surge, he threw his chest forward, crossing the line in a blur. Silence. Then the scoreboard flashed. Jamal Carter, first place. New trials record. The stadium erupted. Jamal gasped for air, his body trembling from exertion. He turned, staring at the board, trying to process it. He had just won the Olympic trials. Coach Harrison pulled him into a bear hug. "You're going to the Olympics, Jamal." Jamal felt the world tilt. He had dreamed of this moment, and now it was real, a familiar face in the crowd. As Jamal soaked in his victory, he noticed someone standing near the edge of the track. Coach Stevens. The disgraced referee stood stiffly, watching the celebration unfold. Their eyes met. For a second, Stevens looked like he wanted to say something. Apologize, maybe. But then he lowered his gaze and walked away. Jamal watched him go, feeling nothing but peace. Coach Stevens had tried to hold him back, but he had only made him stronger. The final moment. Reporters surrounded him, microphones shoved in his face. "Jamal, what do you have to say to the people who doubted you?" Jamal wiped sweat from his brow, breathing heavy. Then, with a small smirk, he spoke. "You can try to cheat me, but you can't outrun the truth." The cameras flashed, capturing the words that would become legendary. Jamal Carter wasn't just an athlete. He was a symbol of resilience. And in a few months, he'd be stepping onto the world's biggest stage, as an Olympian. A few months later, Jamal stood in the Olympic Village, the air thick with anticipation. The world's best athletes surrounded him, sprinters from Jamaica, the US, Kenya, Canada, South Africa. Each one a champion in their own right. But Jamal wasn't intimidated. He belonged here, the Olympic stage. The Olympic Stadium was unlike anything he had ever seen. 80,000 people packed the stands. Cameras from every major network pointed at the track. This was it, the 100-meter Olympic final. He had one shot at gold. Jamal jogged to his lane, shaking out his limbs. He glanced at the competition. To his right, Jordan Reed, the reigning champion. Jordan met his gaze and grinned. "Welcome to the big leagues, kid." Jamal smirked. "Let's see if you can keep up." The announcer's voice boomed over the stadium. "On your marks." Jamal crouched down, his fingers pressing against the cool track. He blocked out everything. The noise, the cameras, the expectations. Just run. The official raised the gun. Bang. The fastest he's ever run. Jamal exploded forward, his body a blur. His arms pumped, his legs burning as he pushed harder than ever before. He felt Jordan beside him, the Jamaican sprinter to his left. For a moment, they were neck and neck. Then, something ignited inside him. Every moment of struggle, every stolen race, every injustice. He surged forward. The finish line approached. Jamal threw his chest forward. He crossed first. A breathless silence filled the stadium. Then the scoreboard lit up. Jamal Carter, 9.72 seconds. New Olympic record. The crowd erupted. Jamal fell to his knees, hands gripping the track. Tears stung his eyes. He had just become an Olympic champion. The moment the world saw him. Gold medal around his neck, Jamal stood on the podium, the national anthem playing. He scanned the stadium. His mother stood in the crowd, hands clasped together, crying tears of joy. Coach Harrison beamed with pride. Jordan Reed, now a silver medalist, clapped him on the back. "Hell of a race, Carter." Jamal grinned. "Told you to keep up." The cameras turned to him, reporters waiting for his words. One question rang out. "Jamal, what do you have to say now?" Jamal lifted the gold medal, his voice steady. "They tried to cheat me, but the truth always wins." The world listened, and for the first time in his life, Jamal Carter wasn't just running. He was leading. Final scene, the legacy begins. A year later, Jamal returned home, not just as an Olympian, but as a symbol of resilience. He stepped onto the track at his old high school. Young athletes gathered around him. He saw himself in their faces. A boy raised his hand. "Coach Carter, how do we get where you are?" Jamal smiled. "You run. No matter what tries to stop you, you run through it, past it, beyond it. And one day you'll realize they can't catch you anymore." The students nodded, absorbing his words. Jamal glanced toward the finish line. The race wasn't over. It was just the beginning. 1 year later, Jamal Carter stood at the edge of the track, watching a group of young sprinters line up at the starting blocks. Their faces were filled with determination, the same fire he had once carried when he was their age. The sun beat down on the track, the air thick with anticipation. It reminded him of his first big race, the one that had been stolen from him. But now, he had reclaimed his story, building something bigger. After the Olympics, Jamal had been offered endorsement deals, TV appearances, sponsorships. But none of that mattered as much as this. He had used his platform and his winnings to open the Carter Track Academy, a place where young athletes, especially those who had been overlooked or underestimated, could train at an elite level regardless of background or resources. A place where no one would ever have to fight just to be given a fair chance. A special visit. As the students stretched and prepared for sprints, a familiar voice spoke behind him. "You've built something real here, Jamal." Jamal turned to see Coach Harrison, standing at the edge of the track, watching with a proud expression. Jamal grinned. "Couldn't have done it without you." Coach Harrison chuckled. "That's not true. You always had it in you." Jamal glanced back at his athletes. "They do too. They just need someone to believe in them." Coach Harrison nodded. "Then they've got the right guy, the kids who needed him." As Jamal walked toward the starting line, a young boy, no older than 13, fidgeted nervously. Jamal knelt beside him. "What's your name, kid?" "Dante," the boy mumbled. Jamal noticed his shoes, worn, barely holding together. He knew the struggle. He had been that kid once. "You fast, Dante?" Dante hesitated. "I think so. Jamal smirked. You don't think, you know. And the only way to prove it, he pointed at the finish line. Dante nodded, standing taller. Jamal clapped him on the back. All right then, let's see what you've got. The starter called out. Runners, take your marks. Jamal stepped back, watching. The gun fired. Dante took off. And as Jamal watched him fly across the track, something inside him stirred. It was the same fire that had pushed him forward. The same fight that had made him an Olympian. And now, he was passing it on. The final words. Later that evening, Jamal stood alone on the track, the floodlights casting long shadows. He thought about how far he had come, how they had tried to cheat him, how they had tried to hold him back. And yet, he had outrun them all. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. Proud of you, son. A text from Jordan Reed. You training for Paris 2024? I want a rematch. Jamal chuckled, typing back. I'm always running. And with that, he picked up his stopwatch, ready to train the next generation. Because the race never really ends. It just keeps moving forward. 5 years later, Jamal Carter stood in front of a packed auditorium, dressed in a sharp suit, gold medals hanging from his neck. The crowd, students, coaches, athletes, and educators, listened intently. He had been invited to give the keynote speech at the National Sports Summit, an event dedicated to fostering fairness and inclusion in athletics. It was a long way from where he had started. He adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began the speech that inspired a generation. I was 17 the first time I learned that winning wasn't always enough, Jamal said, his voice steady. The room was silent. I ran the best race of my life, crossed the finish line first. Only to be told that it didn't count. He paused, scanning the audience. Some nodded, some shifted uncomfortably. But I didn't let that moment define me. I refused to let someone else's bias tell me what I was capable of. And that's the lesson I want you all to take from this. Your talent is yours. No one can take it from you. A ripple of applause spread through the room. He continued, there are kids out there, right now, training their hearts out, but facing barriers they shouldn't have to. It's on us to coach better, to judge fairly, to make sure that talent is what wins races, not prejudice. The applause grew louder. And if anyone ever tries to tell you that you're not good enough, that you don't belong, just do what I did. Jamal smiled. Run faster. The crowd rose to their feet, the ovation deafening. The next chapter. After the speech, as Jamal stepped off stage, a man in a suit approached him. Mr. Carter, the man said, shaking his hand, we'd love to discuss a possible position for you with the Olympic Athletic Committee. Jamal blinked. You mean as a consultant? The man smiled. We mean as a board member. Jamal exhaled sharply. This was more than just running now. This was about changing the system from the inside, making sure what happened to him never happened to another athlete. He smiled, shaking the man's hand. Let's talk. The legacy continues. That night, Jamal sat in his office at the Carter Track Academy, staring at the old race footage from years ago. The moment Coach Stevens had tried to rob him. How far he had come since then. A knock at the door. Dante, now 17, stood in the doorway. The same kid who had once lined up nervously at his academy, now a rising track star. You wanted to see me, coach? Dante asked. Jamal grinned. Yeah. You ready for nationals? Dante nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. I know I'm fast, but what if they try to cheat me? Jamal leaned forward, meeting his eyes. Then you do what I did. Dante tilted his head. Run faster. Jamal smirked. No, run like they can't stop you. Dante grinned. I like that. Jamal patted his shoulder. Now get some rest. We've got work to do. As Dante left, Jamal looked out over the track, the floodlights glowing in the night. The race was never just about speed. It was about proving that no one could outrun the truth. And Jamal Carter was making sure no one ever would. 10 years later, Jamal Carter stood at the entrance of the Carter Center for Athletics and Education, watching as students poured into the state-of-the-art facility. What had once been a small track academy had now grown into a full-fledged institution. A training ground for the next generation of athletes, built for those who had been overlooked, doubted, or dismissed. But here, everyone got a fair start, a historic announcement. Jamal sat in front of a panel of reporters, microphones lined up in front of him. Cameras flashed, broadcasting the press conference live. A journalist leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, today marks the 10-year anniversary of your Olympic victory. What's next for you?" Jamal smiled. "I've had a good run," he said. "But it's time to build something bigger." Murmurs spread through the room. Jamal glanced at the banner behind him, the Carter Initiative for Fair Play in Sports. "This isn't just about me," he continued. "It's about making sure that every athlete gets the opportunities they deserve, regardless of background, race, or where they come from. We're creating scholarship programs, mentorship initiatives, and expanding access to training facilities across the country." A reporter raised a hand. "What inspired this?" Jamal leaned forward. "Because I was that kid, the one they tried to hold back, the one they tried to cheat. And if I hadn't fought, if I hadn't kept running, I wouldn't be here today." The room fell silent. Jamal continued, his voice steady. "No one should have to fight that hard just to be treated fairly. So if I have the chance to change that, I will." The room erupted into applause. A message from an old rival. Later that evening, as Jamal scrolled through his messages, one name caught his eye: Jordan Reed, the same sprinter he had beaten in the Olympics. The message was simple. "Still training for a comeback? I want another race." Jamal laughed, shaking his head as he typed back, "You know, I never stop running." A visit to the past. Before heading home, Jamal made a stop. His old high school track. It looked smaller than he remembered. The bleachers rusted. The paint faded. He stood at the starting line, closing his eyes. He could still hear the echo of that first race. The moment he had been cheated. The moment he had chosen to fight back. And now, he had run so far they could never catch him. A deep breath. A final glance at the finish line. Then he turned and walked away, toward the future he had built. Because the race was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving himself right. 20 years later, Jamal Carter walked through the halls of the International Athletics Federation headquarters, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. He had come a long way from the young athlete who had once been cheated out of a race. Now, he wasn't just a former Olympian. He was the newly appointed president of the International Athletics Federation. And he was about to change the sport forever. A new era begins. Journalists filled the conference room, cameras flashing as Jamal took his seat at the podium. The world watched as he adjusted the microphone, his expression serious but calm. For years, we've seen athletes, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds, face discrimination, unfair rulings, and obstacles beyond the track. I know this firsthand. And today, we begin the work of ensuring that every race is fair, every athlete is judged by their ability, and that no one will ever have to fight the way I did just to be seen. The crowd erupted into applause. It wasn't just about the sport anymore. It was about changing the system for good. An unexpected encounter. After the press conference, Jamal walked through the lobby when a familiar voice stopped him. President Carter. He turned. Coach Stevens. Older now, his hair gray, his posture less rigid than before. Jamal's first instinct was to walk away. But something about the way Stevens looked at him, not with arrogance but regret, made him pause. "I followed your career," Stevens admitted. "You turned out to be one hell of an athlete." Jamal crossed his arms. "Didn't seem like you thought so back then." Stevens sighed. "I was wrong. I let my own biases blind me. And I took something from you that you never should have had to fight to get back." Jamal studied him. For years, he had imagined this moment. The man who once tried to hold him down, now acknowledging his mistakes. And yet, he didn't feel anger. He felt peace. "Apology accepted," Jamal finally said. Stevens looked relieved. "I appreciate that." Jamal took a step forward. "But let me be clear, it's not just about me. It's about making sure what you did to me never happens to anyone else." Stevens nodded. And I hope you succeed. Jamal watched as he walked away, closing a chapter he never thought would find resolution. The final race. 1 year later, at the Summer Olympics, Jamal stood at the track again. Not as a competitor, but as the leader of the organization that now oversaw the sport. He watched as Dante, now a world-class sprinter, took his mark. The gun fired, and Dante ran. Jamal smiled as the young athlete crossed the finish line, breaking a world record. The cameras turned to Jamal, waiting for a reaction. He simply nodded, because in that moment he realized this had always been the real victory. Not just his success, but paving the way for those who came after him. And as Dante stood on the podium, gold medal in hand, Jamal whispered to himself, "The race never ends. We just passed the baton." 30 years later, Jamal Carter stood at the edge of the Olympic track, the roar of the stadium washing over him like a familiar wave. Except this time, he wasn't competing. He wasn't coaching. He wasn't officiating. He was lighting the Olympic torch, a legacy cemented. Jamal Carter had become more than an athlete, more than an Olympian, more than a leader in the sport. He had become a symbol of resilience, justice, and excellence. His fight had changed track and field forever. Under his leadership, new policies had been implemented. Every race was reviewed for fairness, ensuring bias was eliminated. Young athletes from underprivileged backgrounds received direct funding and scholarships. Officials who abused their power were permanently banned. The sport was finally fair. And now, he had been honored with the highest privilege, lighting the torch for the Summer Olympics. The moment the world watched, the cameras zoomed in on Jamal as he took the final steps up the grand staircase, the Olympic flame burning in his hands. He paused, looking out at the world. He thought of his mother, his coach, his younger self. He thought of the race that had been stolen from him, and how he had run past every obstacle ever placed in his way. He lifted the torch high, and with one strong motion, he lit the flame. The stadium erupted. A young runner approaches. After the ceremony, as Jamal stood backstage, a young sprinter approached him, no older than 17. "Mr. Carter?" The boy hesitated. "I just wanted to say, your story changed my life." Jamal smiled. "You a runner?" The boy nodded. Trying to be, Jamal studied him. He saw himself in the kid's nervous energy, the hunger in his eyes. "You don't need to try," Jamal said. "You just need to run." The boy grinned, and Jamal knew the legacy would live on, because as long as there were races to run, challenges to overcome, and stories to be told, his fight would never be forgotten. Final scene, the passing of the baton. Years later, Jamal sat in his study, watching a new generation of athletes take the track. His hair was grayer now, his movements slower, but his fire had never faded. His grandson, just 10 years old, sat beside him, watching the race in awe. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "did you ever race?" Jamal smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah," he said, "I raced." His grandson's eyes sparkled. "Did you win?" Jamal chuckled. "You tell me." He gestured at the framed medals, awards, and photographs covering the walls, the proof of a lifetime of victories. But then he turned back to the TV, watching the young runners fly across the track. "No," Jamal murmured. "The real victory is that I'm not the only one running anymore." His grandson smiled. "I want to run too." Jamal patted his back. "Then go, kid. Run." And as his grandson dashed outside, Jamal Carter watched, knowing the race would never end. Only the runners would change. 50 years later, the world had changed, but some things remained the same. Athletes still pushed their limits, races were still won and lost, and young kids still dreamed of running faster than anyone before them. But now, thanks to Jamal Carter, they never had to wonder if the race was fair. A name that lived forever. The Jamal Carter International Athletics Stadium stood at the heart of the Olympic Village, a state-of-the-art facility named after the man who had once been cheated out of a race, only to become the most influential figure in the sport's history. Inside the stadium, banners hung high: fairness, integrity, excellence, Jamal's core values, the ones he had fought for. And tonight, The world was gathered here to honor him one last time, the celebration of a legend. A massive crowd filled the stadium as the lights dimmed, the spotlight shining on the center stage. Jamal, now in his 90s, sat in a wheelchair, his grandson standing proudly beside him. A voice boomed over the speakers. Tonight, we celebrate the man who not only ran races but changed them forever. Ladies and gentlemen, we honor Olympic champion and lifelong advocate, Mr. Jamal Carter. The stadium erupted in applause. Jamal smiled softly, his eyes misty. It wasn't the cheers that moved him. It was knowing that the young athletes standing on that track today would never face what he had once endured. He had won more than gold. He had one change, a final message. A reporter knelt beside Jamal, microphone in hand. Mr. Carter, after all these years, do you have any final words for the next generation? Jamal took a deep breath, his voice slower but still steady. I spent my whole life running, he said. At first, I ran because I had to. Then I ran to prove them wrong. But in the end, he glanced at the young athletes around him, their eyes wide with admiration. I ran so that you wouldn't have to. The stadium fell silent. Then, thunderous applause. The final scene. That night, as Jamal sat on his porch, his grandson by his side, he looked up at the stars, his hands resting on the arms of his chair. Grandpa, his grandson asked, do you miss running? Jamal chuckled. No, kid. I ran enough for a lifetime. His grandson grinned. But you always told me. The race never ends. Jamal smiled. That's right. He turned, looking at the young boy, the next generation. Now it's your turn. His grandson stood, stretching his legs. And then, without another word, he took off running. Jamal watched him go, a satisfied smile on his face. The race would go on. But Jamal Carter had finally crossed his finish line. And he had won. 100 years later, the world had long moved forward. But the name Jamal Carter had never been forgotten. His story had become legend. His impact had become permanent. And his race, it was still being run. The Hall of Champions. In the heart of the Olympic Museum, a grand exhibit stood dedicated to the greatest athletes of all time. Among them, at the center of it all, was the Jamal Carter Memorial Wing. A massive golden plaque bore his name, and beneath it, in bold letters, the man who changed the race. Holograms replayed his Olympic victories, his speeches, his battles against injustice. Generations of young runners, tourists, and sports historians stood in awe, reading about his journey. How he had been cheated, how he had fought back, how he had built something bigger than himself. A group of children gathered near the exhibit, watching a recorded clip of Jamal's final interview. His aged voice echoed through the hall. I spent my whole life running so that no one else would have to prove they belonged. A little boy turned to his father. Dad, do you think I could be like Jamal Carter one day? The father smiled. Son, because of Jamal Carter, you already can. A race that never ends. Outside the museum, in a stadium that still carried his name, the Olympic trials were happening once again. A new generation of runners stood on the track, preparing to take their marks. No one worried about fairness anymore. No one feared injustice, because Jamal Carter had erased that fear long ago. The gun fired. The runners took off. Faster, stronger, freer. And somewhere, in the echoes of history, Jamal Carter's spirit ran with them. Final words on a stone that will never fade. In a quiet cemetery, on a beautifully kept memorial, an inscription read, Jamal Carter, he ran for justice, he ran for change, he ran for us all. Beneath it, 3 simple words. The race continues, and as long as the world had runners, dreamers, and fighters, it always would. 150 years later, the world had evolved in ways Jamal Carter could have never imagined. Technology had advanced, cities had transformed, but one thing remained constant: runners still ran. And every time they did, his name still echoed across the track. The future of the race. At the Global Athletic Center, the most prestigious sports institution in the world, a massive statue of Jamal Carter stood tall, overlooking the stadium. The inscription below read, "He ran for more than gold. He ran for justice. Every year, at the start of the World Sprint Championships, young runners from all over the world gathered beneath the statue, placing their hands on the bronze surface, whispering words of gratitude. It had become a tradition, a tribute to the man who had once fought for fairness in the sport they now took for granted. The first race on Mars. The world had long moved beyond Earth. Colonies had formed on Mars, and for the first time in history, the intergalactic Olympic Games were being held. A Martian-born sprinter stood at the starting line of the 100-meter dash, his heart pounding. He wore a small patch on his uniform, a golden silhouette of Jamal Carter sprinting. The starting official, broadcasting to billions across planets, took a deep breath before calling out the words, "Runners, take your marks." The gun fired, and even on a new world, in a new century, the race still continued. Because Jamal Carter's story had never been just about speed. It had been about moving forward. And no matter where humanity went, they would always keep running. Final words that would never be forgotten. On a plaque in the heart of the Hall of Legends, a final inscription stood beneath Jamal's name. Time will pass, the world will change, but the race for justice, equality, and greatness will never end. Keep running, and so they did. Faster, stronger, freer, and as long as feet touched the track. Jamal Carter would never be forgotten. The race never ends.